Hello everyone and welcome to the Green Couch Reviews. Now, if any of you like movies about as much as I do, and chances are if you're watching the show you probably do, then you're most likely aware of the extremely mixed response Danish director Nicolas Winding Refn's latest film, Only God Forgives, received at this year's Cannes Film Festival.
Half the audience loudly booed the film, or even walked out, while the other half gave it a standing ovation. And so far the reviews have followed suit, with many criticizing the film for an overly slow pace, misanthropic storyline, and lack of a cohesive narrative.
Since then, I've seen the film a few times and can confirm that these criticisms are valid, although, personally, I don't consider them negatives. However, one thing I have seen are frequent comparisons between this film and Refn's previous effort, Drive, also starring Ryan Gosling, and in my opinion, that's not the one to focus on. If you want to see where Only God Forgives might fit in Refn's filmography, I think you may have to look one film earlier.
Valhalla Rising stars Mads Mikkelsen, a Danish actor widely known for his role as Le Chiffre in Casino Royale, and more recently on television as the eponymous cannibal psychiatrist in NBC's Hannibal, who made his film debut alongside Refn with the latter's first movie, Pusher. Here he plays One Eye.
3 guesses why he's called that.
A mute Viking warrior kept prisoner as a kind of gladiator slave, pitted against other fighters in battles to the death while his captors bet on the results. So, kinda like Conan after he got taken off that big wheel in the middle of nowhere. And like Conan, he is really, really, really good at killing people.
Yeah, keeping a guy like this on a leash? Bad idea. See? Told you so.
Now free, One Eye wanders around for a bit, followed by the boy who helped care for him during his captivity, because who else is he going to follow now that everyone else is dead? This ends up being very important because it means we still have at least one character who's able to talk properly when they run into a bunch of Christian warriors resting after a little of the old ultra-violence. Because he's such a great fighter, they decide to recruit One Eye for some Crusader action down in the Holy Land, which he goes along with, because hey, more dudes to fight. And after a long boat ride, they end up in... not the Holy Land. Yep, our heroes have gone way off course and have landed somewhere in North America, almost 500 years before Columbus blundered his way there while trying to get to the Indies.
And as weird as this film can get, this part is actually one of the more realistic ones.
Valhalla Rising can be seen as a fictional retelling of how the Norse people first crossed the Atlantic Ocean and discovered what came to be called Vinland in the Icelandic sagas, notably that of Eric the Red, which featured Leif Erikson, possibly one of the first Europeans to reach the Americas. And in fact, remains of Norse colonies have been unearthed by archaeologists, in particular the Lasso Meadows in Newfoundland, which date back to around 1000 AD. Of course, those sagas were only written down 2 or 3 centuries later, which left Refn, along with co-writers Roy Jacobson and Matthew Reed, free to make up whatever story they wanted.
What resulted can best be described as Terrence Malick filming The New World while tripping his balls off on bad acid.
That description should give you an idea of the kind of movie we're dealing with here. Long shots of natural landscapes, very little dialogue, a droning, almost industrial score, acts of gruesome violence, and an increasing number of what-the-fuck moments.
This might come as a shock considering the trailer promised this. And the actual film consists mostly of this.
Did I ever forgive my father for bringing me to this place?
Yeah, this happens to a lot of Refn's movies.
Short action beats aside, the film is almost entirely a mood piece, focusing more on atmosphere and tone over narrative and characters. One consequence of this is a really slow pace, making it feel a hell of a lot longer than its hour-and-a-half runtime would initially suggest. The other is that this story of Vikings discovering North America gets increasingly weird as time goes on.
Not that it wasn't that way to begin with. I mean, after all, our main character's a precog.
Throughout the film, One Eye occasionally receives glimpses of future events. These red-tinged visions, which generally appear once per chapter, could be seen as referencing Norse mythology, specifically the chief god of their pantheon, Odin, who gave up one of his eyes in exchange for great knowledge. Another element that could be seen as a quote from legend is the passage through a seemingly unnatural mist. As it happens, Niflheim, one of the Norse underworlds reserved for those who died of unheroic deaths, translates to Mist Home.
The boy said it was from hell. Maybe that's where we're going.
Now, obviously, all of this is just conjecture, since nowhere in the film is any of this confirmed or dismissed outright. The only genuinely supernatural element on display is One Eye's clairvoyance, and for all we know, the whole Odin angle is just a coincidence, missing eye and all. But while we're on the subject of gods, let's not forget the other divine presence in the room.
Out of all of Valhalla Rising's themes, the conflict of different religions and cultures is definitely the major one. As the initial title crawl tells us, Christianity has been pushing northwards and displacing the native Norse polytheism. And not just with missionaries, as our Crusader friends so aptly demonstrate. The whole point of the fighting that begins the film, after all, was to raise money so the chieftain can bribe them into leaving his people alone.
A much-travelled man once told me that they eat their own god. Eat his flesh, drink his blood. Abominable.
Of course, it's only after our protagonists set sail and get lost on the wrong side of the Atlantic that the real meat of this theme gets explored. After being stranded in the mist for days, it quickly becomes apparent that under a thin veneer of godliness and piety, all their old medieval superstitions are still very much alive, as they immediately think a curse is responsible for their situation. Where they initially brought the boy along as a good luck charm, he now becomes the source of all their misfortune. Luckily for him, he has a very capable bodyguard. This leads me to believe that for many of these men, faith isn't really their primary motivation, merely standing in as an excuse for war and plunder against infidels. Indeed, once it becomes clear that the lands and riches they were promised won't be forthcoming, these men of God quickly start to turn on each other.
You promised us riches. And the Holy Lands. Well, One Eye took us to hell. And there is no God.
There are those, however, for whom faith is the only necessary motivation. The leaders of the expedition, referred to by Refn as the general and the priest, are both easily the most devout of its members. Where they differ is in what happens to their faith after the events of the film put it through the ringer. The general, on the one hand, becomes increasingly fanatical, believing that God has sent them here to claim this new land and convert the locals. He doubles down on blind belief in the face of adversity, regardless of how dire the circumstances are.
We've raised the cross. Now we bring the sword. The heathen will be converted, their sins cleansed, a new Jerusalem established.
The priest, however, is seemingly the more reasonable of the two, pointing out that their limited resources and manpower make such an endeavor pretty much impossible. We later learn that he joined the Crusades in order to obtain forgiveness for the sins of his fallen sons, a far cry from the more militaristic or mercantile desires of his compatriots.
We're more than flesh and blood. More than revenge. All of these things go. You should consider your soul.
Things between the two men go about as well as can be expected. The other faction in this little drama, the Native American tribe that pursues the Vikings, isn't really explored much in terms of their religion or culture, which makes sense since our point of view remains with the Europeans throughout.
On the other hand, the natives aren't really portrayed as out-and-out villains either, despite being the ostensible antagonists of this story. For one thing, they only start to kill off the Vikings after they've disturbed one of the locals' graveyards, which eventually gets desecrated with a big-ass cross, so I guess we can't really blame them for being pissed. And in the end, they spare the boy when One Eye sacrifices himself to them. All in all, they convince neither better nor worse than anybody else in the movie, just a bunch of people defending their turf from what they see as foreign invaders in a time where savagery is the name of the game.
And speaking of One Eye, where does he fit in all this? He isn't really a man of faith, as far as I can tell, and he doesn't seem that interested in power or money. About the only thing he cares about is his own survival and eventually the kid. But then, why does he go along with the Crusaders? What does he really want?
One thing to remember here is that we're talking about a man who can see the future. Each of his visions takes the form of a shot from later in the movie, meaning that the events they show will occur exactly as depicted, minus the red filter, of course. Thing is, we never see One Eye actually trying to change anything based on what he sees. Even when he gets a premonition of his own death, he just bills himself for Cairn and keeps going along as he was before. It's possible he isn't consciously aware of his precognition, or perhaps it's simply that the future isn't something that can be changed once it's been witnessed, and that One Eye has no other path to take except the one he's fated to go down. His entire motivation may well boil down to something as simple and nihilistic as, well, it's gonna happen anyway, whether I like it or not, might as well just go with it. In a film focused on religion and ideology, our hero may be the man who ultimately has neither.
Of course, this would all be much easier to interpret if the man would just open his mouth and say something once in a while. Then again, according to Refn, the original ending had One Eye getting into a flying saucer and shooting off into space, except he changed it because he thought it would be too easy to interpret. I doubt even One Eye could explain that.
Valhalla Rising definitely isn't for everyone, but then again, the same could be said for just about every film in Refn's repertoire. The movie creates a bleak and fatalistic atmosphere throughout, with minimalist dialogue and a glacial pace that can leave viewers who are expecting something more along the lines of a traditional drama or adventure piece confused or alienated. Rather, the film falls into a cinematic niche alongside others like Herzog's Aguirre or Jodorowsky's El Topo, and if you think this one was a head trip, then trust me when I say that those ones are even weirder.
In any case, if the thought of not understanding what the hell is going on, except for the fact that it probably won't have a happy ending, doesn't bother you, then you should definitely check this one out. And while you're at it, take a look at the rest of Refn's filmography. Just don't put too much faith in the trailers. And on that note, I'm Bastian, and I'll see you next time on the couch.